So the Buddha is finally coming out of the woods after many years of ascetic practices. How do you think he feels, Sean, walking out of the woods after all this training?
Well, he's got to feel pretty good, right?
No, he actually feels like absolute shit.
What?
That's why he came out of the woods in the first place, because nothing was working, right? He left his castle because, as we all know, the Buddha, according to the legend, was a prince, right? He lived
Right.
in a castle, and he left all of this to go on his quest to find what was the meaning of life, right? And he went with all these guys that did all these aesthetic practices, like standing on one leg and pointing at the sun, or yogic practices, or whipping yourself with vines and everything, and nothing worked. And he's like, F this shit. And he left the woods after many years. He's like, this is not helping anybody. And he left the woods, and he walked out of the woods, and he was like, I need a break. And he went down towards the river, and there was a tree there. And of course, we all know the story. He sat under the tree, and only when he sat under that tree and just said, the hell with everything, I'm just gonna sit here and take a break, only at that point did something start to blossom within him. Have you ever seen like a painting or a representation of Buddha when he comes out of the woods? Ever seen it? He looks
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
right? He looks like complete shit, right? Right? I mean,
Right.
he's like skinny. He's like ready to die. He's got like scars all over him. All right. There's a statue in one of the temples down here in Kamakura. Right. If you go to that temple, you can see this big bronze statue of him, and it's when he just came out of the woods. I mean, his face is all hollow. His eyes are sunken. His rib cage is sticking out. He just looks a mess. Right. And so people don't, I think, realize that Buddha, he gave up all of that stuff. I mean, it's quite well known, but I think some people forget it. Why am I mentioning all this? Because I'm going to tell you a very important story that I think you're all going to like. But before we get into that story, I mean, we all know, look, right? You can stand on one leg, point at the sun. You can do yoga postures until, you could bend over backwards, stick your toes up your ass. It still won't make you enlightened, right? I mean, we're laughing, right? We're laughing right now, but this is what's happening in the world, especially in yoga right now, right? I mean, yoga is ridiculous right now. I mean, it's turned into some sort of Cirque du Soleil kind of competition, like who can, do the craziest acrobatic stuff. And yoga was never about that. Like, who in the hell thought it would be a good idea to make power yoga? What the hell does that even mean, right? Let's get serious here, right? I mean, the whole purpose of yoga was completely different. I mean, if you want to be an acrobat, then you go study acrobatics. Go study with a contortionist, right? You're much better off, right? But if you're really studying yoga, you got to switch what you're thinking about here. Yoga has become one of the most detrimental things, I think, to modern people in the whole world right now. I'm going to get a lot of hate for this because, I'm supposedly the guy who does yoga in the Bujinkan, right? But
Right, right. You love yoga.
I do love yoga as its original sort of meaning is, right? So I prefer nowadays. I think, of course, the postures are fine. You can do yogic postures, which are great. I believe it, but don't go too far, right? You don't have to, like I said before, do a back bend, stick your toes in your ass, and wiggle your base chakra around. You don't have to do that, right? I mean, it might help, but let's say you really don't have to do that. Okay, you're going to end up hurting yourself, to be honest with you. I've seen so many people hurt themselves in yoga. To get a little bit serious here, I mean, it's become a competition, right? Who can do the craziest type of physical, movements and stuff. And look, I think if you're human, you should be stretching. You should have full range of motion. The original yogic postures, there was only a very limited amount, and they were like, 15 postures, and they were mostly sitting postures. Makes you think, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, here's this kind of a story about how this kind of quest for maybe enlightenment can be very detrimental. And Sensei would always tell us, look, forget about that. Forget about this. People tend to confuse martial arts and religion. They want to kind of lump them together and stuff. And Sensei was always against that. He was always adamant. In fact, he kind of liked the Buddha's way, because the Buddha didn't profess some sort of religion. He talked about things that you can do in your life to make your life better, right? It wasn't about believing in something outside of yourself. It was about fundamentally you and how you can look at yourself and make things better. I'm going to make a video about this next time, because he spoke in Spain about this once, and I think it's worthwhile everyone see that. Maybe next time we'll make that video. So anyways, here's the story. A young man comes to Japan to study the Bujinkan. Now, he trains a little bit with sensei, and he gets his idea that he wants to be enlightened. Now, you got to be careful about this thing, when you want to be enlightened. This is really a dangerous thing. This idea of enlightenment should just be left by the side. So here's what happens. Young man comes, and he trains a bit, and he gets this idea that he wants to be enlightened. And he's going to do everything he can to be enlightened. In fact, he's going to just go sit down, and he's not going to move. He's going to sit down under a tree like the Buddha and try to copy the Buddha. And he's not going to move from that tree until he's enlightened. Okay? Yeah, this didn't work out well at all. So by and large, we start hearing these things about him, like, I don't want to say his name. He's still around in the Bujinkan. And I'm sure if he sees this, he'll probably laugh and maybe comment on it. I hope he does. But so he's doing everything to become enlightened, and we hear these rumors, and then we hear that he's getting sick, right? Because he's like fasting and sitting under a tree or sitting in front of a kamidama or something. And he's not moving. He's just he's got to stay there till he's enlightened, right? Well, eventually it gets to the point where he can't even move anymore. Basically, he gets himself so sick and so unhealthy that he can barely move. So one day he comes to the dojo in Noda, and he can barely walk. He crawls into the dojo. He's sick as a dog. He can't move. He's laying there, and Sensei's like, "What are you doing? Would you forget about being enlightened? Stop it. You just have to train. Just keep training." And the guy's like, So eventually Sensei goes over to him, and he puts his hand in front of him, in front of his chest, and he maybe says a few words or says something to him. And at that moment, the guy says he feels this rush of warm energy, warm feeling in him. And he starts to feel a little more energized. And within 10 or 15 minutes, he says his body starts to feel better. He starts feeling like he can move and get up, and he wants to train. And he gets up and he trains, right? And he kind of forgets about now this idea. He's like, well, forget about all that. I'm just going to keep training. And he did. He kept training. I think he's still training, and I hope he's doing really well. I don't really talk to him that much, but I hope he's doing real well. This is a really funny story, because this happens all the time, right? People are trying to become enlightened. And here's the problem. They're trying to become enlightened, right? It's completely different. The Buddha, like I said, was in the forest, whipping himself with the vines, doing all these crazy postures, fasting, trying to meditate, and nothing worked. And so he left it behind. He came out of the woods and he said, I'm done. That's ridiculous. I'm going to die. I'm going to die and not get any sense of, this greatness of this life. I'm just going to die miserable in the woods. So he left. He gave up. He said, I'm done. And he walked out. He sat under the tree, totally gave up, sat under the tree, giving up, and just relaxed. Just sat down and relaxed. Just forgot about everything. And that's the moment when something blossomed. That's when the seed cracked in him, right? Now there's a completely different feeling if you go to that tree to sit under it to try to become enlightened. You see? It's a completely different thing. The Buddha sat down and gave up. The mind wandered away, and something else came into the forefront of his being. But if you sit under a tree trying to be enlightened, you're using the mind to try to control the mind, right? You're like, I'm going to become enlightened, and I'm going to use my mind to be. It's never going to happen, right? The mind is like an eel, a slippery eel, right?
An eel.
Eel, an eel, like an eel, slippery, slimy eel, right? It's like an eel. The more you try to hold it, the more you try, it escapes your hands. Now think about this. You're trying to control an eel, the mind, with the mind, another eel. So you got two slippery, slimy eels, and they're rubbing them together. You know what I mean? And then the mind is like a ninja because it has Bujinkan. It can divide itself into like a whole crowd of people, right? Haven't you ever done that in your mind? There's like someone saying do it, or someone saying don't do it, someone saying, well, maybe it could be a good idea, maybe you should do this instead, and there's a whole crowd of people talking in your brain. Well, now you got a whole bunch of eels, and it just becomes a total mess, right? You're sitting under a tree.
Talk about the voices in my head.
Right? Right? Well, you're sitting under a tree now with like a handful of eels, trying to control them, trying to keep them still. Now you may get them still for like 2 or 3 minutes. But can you imagine the effort it's taking to still those eels? You'll be having sweat run down. You'll be like breathing heavily and trying to control that. And that's not what the Buddha did. He said, "The hell with the eels." He threw them in the river. He let them float away. Right? So it can be a very difficult thing. That's why Sensei would always say, forget about this idea of becoming enlightened. I got a riddle for y'all. Nobody becomes enlightened. Now, if you understand what I'm talking about here, put in the comments below. The idea of becoming enlightened itself will become the obstacle in your life, will become the obstacle of you experiencing something else. Like I said, the difference is the Buddha did nothing, and by doing nothing, he gained everything. And if you understand this, maybe you'll start to understand the ideas behind Dori, of what Sensei talked about in his later years of life. So, as we wrap it up, I just wanted to say that Sensei would always stress, just keep training with good people and a good heart, and all your questions will be answered. And you won't even have to ask anybody for the answers. I want to say a big thank you to some of my friends, Jan and Torben, who've made contributions. Thank you so much for your contributions, and thank you all for watching the videos. That really helps us out. If you did like the video, go ahead and like it. It really helps the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications. And if you'd like to make a contribution, you can find a donation link in the show notes below. Also, let us know in the comments below. Have you had an experience like this? Have you had things fall into place when you actually let go of some things? And of course, please let me know what else you want to see. We'll try to make some videos on that as well. See you in the next one, everybody. Thanks a lot.